he didn't just do miracles to show off so that everybody would think that he's, super cool. Like Jesus wasn't doing them to show off, but he was doing miracles to show people that he is faithful and strong, that he is able to heal, that he is able to provide, that he cares even for you and for me. And so the miracle that we're going to be looking at today is when Jesus calmed the storm. When he calmed the storm, and this is a very familiar story if you've maybe grown up in church. Talk about it in Sunday school, and it's a very famous story for people to paint. In fact, Rembrandt has a famous painting that apparently was actually stolen of this scene of Jesus calming the storm. And storms can be crazy. You guys ever been in a storm before? I don't know where you guys live that aren't raising your hands. Like we're in storms all the time, it seems like, but some storms are more severe than others, aren't they? I remember when I was a teenager, I went camping with a bunch of friends, and we're out camping, and it seems like it's gonna be a stormy night. And we set up all of our tents, and we're having a good time, and we camp, and it starts raining, and it starts lightning, and the winds pick up. Well, we weren't just camping through a storm. As it turned out, it was actually a hurricane that night that came through. And I still remember my friend's tent. Apparently, something was wrong with the zipper on the bottom of his tent, and it could not close up. And I saw it in the morning, and his tent had 6 inches of water inside of his tent. The entire campground turned into a river. We had a screen house set up over our picnic table and our cooking areas. The screen house totally collapsed from the amount of rain that was falling down. Needless to say, we decided to call our camping trip short, and we packed up and headed for home. But it was a storm, and storms can be crazy when you're in the middle of them. I've never been in a major storm on the open water before, but I was in a small storm when I was younger as well. And my dad had about a 9-foot dinghy, and we would take this out in all kinds of water. And we were out in the water with this, and it had a little, 5-horsepower motor on it, and the winds picked up, and it started raining torrential. Then it starts hailing on top of that, and the waves are crashing against the side of this boat. And I'm thinking, this is it, we're dead. Like, the waves weren't even that big, but the boat was so small. And although my life was not in danger, I can understand the fear that would accompany somebody who was in a storm on the open water. And that's what we find here in Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, we're starting in verse 35. It says, as evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, these are his closest friends, his closest followers, he said, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. Let's cross over to the other side of the lake. Now, keep in mind what Jesus was doing. Jesus had spent the entire day preaching to crowds of people who would come to hear him. And often he would preach on a shore, and he would, as the crowds would move in closer and closer to him, people couldn't see, people couldn't hear. So he would often get in a boat, and they would push out from shore just a little ways, so that way he could speak and almost have a little amphitheater set up there, and he could speak and people could see him comfortably, they could hear him. And Jesus had just spent the day preaching. He had spent time explaining some of his parables to his disciples, and they're right next to the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee. You may have heard of it before, but you might not realize that it is the lowest freshwater lake in the world. It has the lowest elevation of a freshwater lake. And so it's not actually a sea as much as it is a lake. The Dead Sea is lower, but that has a high salt content. The Sea of Galilee does not have a high salt content. It's fresh water, and it's the lowest lake. It's about 13 miles long and 8 miles across. And so Jesus and his disciples are going to get in a boat and go across this. It's not a huge trip, but it is a long trip in a boat, and not in a very big boat at that. So it says they took the boat and started out. Now they're in this boat, and the boat, they actually found a boat from that similar era that had sunk, in the Sea of Galilee, and it was about 27 feet long, about 7.5 feet wide. So it probably could hold maybe 20 people or so. So that's probably the kind of boat that Jesus was in at this time. Now, storms would regularly come through the Sea of Galilee because the elevation was so low. The winds would come through this valley and cause all kinds of crazy storms, even to this very day. Storms are very dangerous on the Sea of Galilee. So they take Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. So we don't know how many boats, and we don't know if they made it through the storm. We don't know if they turned back or what happened, but we know that Jesus and his followers and then a bunch of other boats followed along. And so they're going out there in this water. It says, but soon a fierce storm came up, and high waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Imagine that. Imagine being potentially 4 miles away from shore, and the waves start crashing over, filling up this boat, and everyone in it is starting to panic. Now, we got to keep in mind that several of these disciples were experienced sailors. Right, like we know that Peter and Andrew and James and John, these were fishermen. They were used to being on the open water. They knew how to sail, but they were beginning to panic at the storm. I can imagine the fear that they were going through as these waves are crashing over. And isn't it interesting that they were doing exactly what Jesus told them to do? Like Jesus told them to get in the boat and go across the lake. Not only were they in God's will at that moment, but Jesus was also in the boat with them. So they're caught in the middle of a storm, but they're also in the middle of God's will. If you're taking notes, there will be storms even when you're in God's will. Many people have this false assumption that if I'm following God and if I'm doing his will, then I will never have any storms in my life. And yet we see here that Jesus specifically tells them, let's get in the boat, let's go across, and guess what happens? A storm comes. See, they obeyed Jesus and they still found themselves in the middle of a storm. See, God is a God who sometimes leads his people into storms.